Hello and welcome as we dive once again into Goblin Town in the depths of the Misty Mountains.
In the last series of videos, I broke apart old terrain pieces to make awesome goblin bases, experimented with some different techniques for making realistic rocks for an epic diorama, had my first go at Megapore resin to make Golem's cave, and used a crazy amount of popsicle sticks to create even more Goblin Town structures.
The time has finally come to bring this journey to a close and finish my Goblin Town board. So join me, you 8,500 crazy crafters and the 80% of you who have yet to hit that subscribe button. Be sure to stick around to the end of the video for a big channel reveal. I'm Adam Haig and this is 3D Games. So I think all up this board is looking pretty epic as it stands, but I still feel like I need something else.
The massive sweeping scale and epic vistas is part of what makes Sir Peter Jackson's adaptation of Tolkien's life work so compelling, and this is what I want to try and capture with my board. Years ago I made these polystyrene cliffs from the old Battles in Middle-earth magazines, and so I experimented with how they would look framing my board.
I mean, it's getting there, but I want it even bigger.
Cue these massive repurposed blocks of polystyrene.
This thing is going to be massive. I don't have a hot wire cutter big enough to deal with this, so...
Yep, my polystyrene victim was viciously cut down to size. Well, I really didn't want it taking up too much room on my board. Anyway, the very loose idea was to create a cool looking backdrop with a serious amount of added verticality. I also wanted there to be some access points in the form of tunnels for narrative play. To break up the blocky rectangular look, I attached some offcuts using toothpicks and polyurethane glue to fix them in place. These were then carved and shaped to blend seamlessly with the main block. I decided to go for some crazy height by adding another block. I used a Sharpie to make out platform heights so that any ledges I carve in can link up with the existing platforms. This turned out to be a total waste of effort, as I ended up cutting away the marks to reduce the width of the block anyway. I did manage to cut it in one whole piece though, so yeah, that was cool. I instead used a tape measure to very scientifically mark out where I wanted to carve the ledges. That was the only planning I did really. I just cut and carved, stabbed and sliced in ways that seemed interesting to me and let the rock formations form organically. The two halves were joined using toothpicks and polyurethane glue. I was worried about the whole thing tipping over in gameplay, so glued in place chunks of bark and some plaster cast rocks to add weight as well as some rocky texture. These would make it bottom heavy and therefore far more stable. To blow away all these little bits of polystyrene and to help deal with the annoying bubbly and flaky nature of the material, I used a heat gun to partially melt the surface. This would create a slightly more durable skin and make it far easier to deal with. I decided to add another section of rocky wall to create an L-shaped backdrop that could also be detached to create different configurations. I built up the main structure with more blocks of polystyrene using toothpicks and glue before cutting into it with the carving knife. I positioned it next to the bigger rock wall as a guide. I wanted the connection point to form a couple more tunnels that can also act as ledges when separate. Other than that, I once again had no plan and just got stuck in slicing with my knife. I used my hot wire cutter to create a few focus areas across the rock wall with more of a jagged, rocky texture.
Okay, the carving is done. Now I need to tidy up before I move on to the next step.
In this hobby, it's always great to be able to repurpose materials that would otherwise be destined for the landfill. The problem is, polystyrene really is horrible to work with. It's super messy with all the little bits that get everywhere. As I placed it on my board, something about it struck me as deeply unsettling. There's only one way to deal with this childhood trauma. Using some scrappy offcuts of XPS foam, I cut them to size with the carving knife and textured them with the hot wire cutter. XPS is so much better to work with than polystyrene, being far more dense and its ability to take texture. These were attached at various points on the rock wall using toothpicks and glue. The idea was to create some textural variation and to create some interesting rock formations jutting out from the cliffs, and to reduce the look of a giant marshmallow man of my childhood nightmares. I used little bits of XPS and polystyrene offcuts to pack out any gaps between joins. Another major issue with using polystyrene is that the bubbly texture is something that needs extra effort to look convincing as realistic rocks. One way to deal with this is by using sculptor mold. This is a paper pulp and plastic combination that when mixed with water is great for making joins like this seamless, as well as spreading around more generally to hide the look of polystyrene. My next secret weapon is powdered polyfiller. I combined this with house paint at roughly a 1:5 ratio. I added some black paint to the white and mixed it all together thoroughly. This mix was then painted liberally all over the polystyrene using an old paintbrush. You really don't want to use the brand new and fancy paintbrush your special someone bought you for Christmas, because it'll get fucked. The added black makes the paint stand out against the white of the polystyrene, so you can avoid missing any areas by mistake. The filler makes the paint extra thick and tacky, filling up all the nooks and crannies. I went over all the polystyrene with a second coat once the first was dry, to really make sure that realism breaking texture would be hidden. Okay, after applying 2 coats of the filler and paint mix, the polystyrene texture has started to reduce. As you can see, it's kind of created this interesting porous texture now. I'm going to call that done, and I'm going to push on through to the next stage. The next stage involved sealing it. If you've ever worked with filler applied to a spongy material like polystyrene, you'd know that it has a tendency to flake and chip off really easily. To avoid this, I liberally painted on a mix of house paint and Mod Podge. The paint acts as a primer, and the Mod Podge gives the surface a nice strong seal. As long as every surface of foam has been covered, it should now be safe to spray with rattle cans. I gave the whole thing a kind of zenithal highlight with grey by spraying at a rough downwards angle. At least I tried to, and then the nozzle clogged up and refused to work. So I tried again with a cheaper can of grey Rust-Oleum primer, and that worked just fine, thank you. Next I used my airbrush to add some stains and weathering. With a range of browns and greens and washes, I applied some subtle tonal variation to the rock wall to reduce the monotony of grey. I was then interrupted by a visit from this little fellow. The New Zealand fantail, or piwaka waka, is a friendly little bird that likes going after small insects and spiders. Perhaps he was after these guys. According to Māori legend and folklore, this cute little guy is actually the harbinger of death. And as it turned out, he had in fact come to shit on my project. Literally. My Badger Patriot 105, reliable and favourite hobby tool of over 10 years, died. As in, it stopped working, because it was never actually alive.
Luckily for me, I have these wonderful patrons who keep this channel going with Patreon dollars for things like replacement airbrushes.
If you too would like to support this channel, please consider joining my Patreon for as little as the price of a coffee. You could also consider purchasing cool new hobby supplies like this airbrush through my affiliate links, also linked in the description. Okay, so with my patron-sponsored new best friend, I continued to apply some weathering. The addition of a variety of colours really helps breathe life into the rocks and give them a far more realistic and natural look.
Okay, I'm not really liking how dark it is at the moment, so I'm really hoping that with a bit of a dry brush that should brighten things up enough.
I combined some light grey with yellow ochre to create some nice warm highlights. After loading the brush bristles with some paint and removing the excess, I dry brushed the rocks with rapid strokes, concentrating on the raised textures and edges. This really helps define the shape of the rocks and make them stand out more. With the rock walls complete, it's now time to see what they look like with my board. You can see here that the two halves can join to create another tunnel, and they can be separated to create different setups. Many of the Goblin Town platforms are at the right height to connect with the rock wall pathways and ledges, and others can be joined with bridges. I'm really loving the sense of scale these rock walls give the board, and I cannot wait to play a game on it. Let me know in the comments what hobby mishaps you have had along the way. Like, have you had any wild animals ruin your best laid plans? Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell.
Oops, I almost forgot. At the start of this video, I said this. The time has finally come to finish my Goblin Town board. Well, I've changed my mind and there will be one more video. To celebrate finally finishing my Goblin Town board, I'm going to be giving away one of these. Patrons will get a head start with an early screening, so please consider joining, and I'll see you next time at 3D Games. Until then, good hobbying everyone.